Chapter 121. Nate checked on the second dungeon when he first entered his avatar that night. The blighted elves were still maintaining their board in the portal room, the one they used to record all the details about the dungeon. It had taken them a bit, but they had eventually begun to adapt strategies to the traps that were still active. A few days earlier, he probably would have switched up the traps a little on them, just to keep everything working at full efficiency. Now, he had other things on his mind, like the cultivators he was occasionally seeing peek through the dungeon entrance. They had officially found the second dungeon. It didn't seem as though they had made any moves to enter the dungeon itself, not yet, at least, thankfully. His energy reserves were getting better with the latest research improvements. Still, he wasn't quite ready to activate more of the traps again. He wanted more of a buffer before he risked something like that. Having the entire dungeon shut down had been an eye-opening experience. At least the blighted elves were strong enough on their own to hold the cultivators back, especially with the numbers that he was now seeing inside the dungeon. Nate monitored everything for a few more minutes before switching over to the first dungeon. The timer that marked when the dungeon would finish taking control of the portal blinked into being, alongside the various resource counters. It was a terrible countdown timer in his opinion, as it would randomly skip seconds the system decided were unneeded. In other words, the longer the countdown went on uninterrupted, the faster it counted. As long as nothing came through the portal, then he would have complete control of it in under 3 days. In all likelihood, considering how it continued to speed up, maybe even less. Turning his attention away from the portal, he focused on the rest of the first floor of the dungeon. The cultivators that had been trying to invade and destroy the place before had finally pulled out. There were now only 2 of them, sitting in a corridor near the exit room. The rest had all left. He pulled up the event log that the dungeon core had begun creating for him when it reached level 3. It was an interesting little function that allowed him to quickly skim through and read what he would have otherwise missed. In this case, it was the cultivators leaving due to accumulated damage and the risk involved in the operation. At least it seemed as though they figured out that the place was a dungeon. Looking through the logs, it was immediately apparent to him that the dungeon core could hear whatever people were saying while they were inside its walls. It bugged him that all he could do was watch, but not listen. Regardless, it seemed as though the major cultivator concern had been dealt with for the moment. The level 3 upgrade had made the interior of the dungeon too difficult for them to easily damage, and largely solved it on its own. Switching his view to the second floor, he went through the few minor adjustments the dungeon core had made throughout the day. It hadn't created traps or anything of that nature. What it had done was a little more diabolical. It had aimed at the beast's comfort level. The temperature on the entire level had been raised. Corridors had been made thinner, doors between rooms turned into jigsaw puzzle pieces, and small spikes added to the floor where they walked. Everything they did now added some layer of discomfort to their lives. It made them hot, sweaty, and irritable, which in turn made their minds tired and easily distracted during key moments when they fought. The heat would still affect Nate and Aura, but they would still be going in fresh compared to the others. It was a tactic that he wholeheartedly approved of. He would have to see about using it again later on in other dungeons. He switched the camera back to the 2 cultivators near the exit and screamed in frustration. They were talking. He could see their mouths moving, and yet still he could hear nothing. Nate pulled up the event log after a moment and simply used that to read along with a slight delay. It was then that an idea occurred to him. He might not be able to hear them for whatever reason. However, now that the dungeon core was capable of transcribing what they were saying, couldn't it give him subtitles? It took him some finagling to get it working right, as the dungeon core needed to work with the camera views inside his wrist computer, which it directly created a fork of once the system understood what he was trying to do. Once all of that was done and in place though, subtitles promptly began appearing at the bottom of the camera view whenever they were speaking. Next, he just needed to test if it worked in the second dungeon, or if it would only be limited to the first dungeon because of the upgraded core. Either way, he now had a way of actively seeing what people were saying inside his dungeon. It was a little late, now that nearly all of the cultivators had decided to abandon their mission. something that he was still incensed about. After everything they had done in the area, destroying safe havens and creating a monstrous beast wave on the city, they had simply left the dungeon behind. Nate read along with their conversation for a few minutes to see if they would say anything interesting. Aura had been using the access she had to the dungeon system to watch the two that were left as well. Deciding they had seen enough, they headed down to the second floor and got to work. It was a gradual thing, but they had started to notice a change in the beasts day after day. A light had started to go out in their eyes, as though the thing that drove them obsessively onward had begun to fade. Nate had a few thoughts on the matter, but he didn't want to say anything, not until he was sure. Some things were better kept to yourself, where they couldn't harm anyone if you were wrong. However, for the moment at least, they were still more than willing to continue throwing themselves at Nate's cookeries as he practiced throughout the night. Anna, along with Lindsay's brother Landon, had returned to the Crichton estate sometime in the middle of the night. Aura had made the mistake of plodding around in plain view as she and Nate went to get breakfast. It was promptly discovered that Lindsay wasn't the only one who liked cute, fluffy animals. Anna was the only one to discover her extra tails though, at least for the moment. Really? What is with you people, and just glomping onto her like your life depends on it? Nate complained as Anna looked up at him questioningly. Her hand was currently latched onto a tail, hidden behind Aura's illusions. Don't look at me like that. Don't you know that it's rude to grab someone's tail? Surprisingly, Anna dropped it and released Aura, who promptly hid behind Nate's legs. Right, sorry about that. Lost my head for a second there. She tilted her head as she stood. I didn't know you had a beast companion, especially one who is so special. It's a fairly recent thing. She found me during the expedition this last weekend, which was entirely true, in a sense. As for her being special, please keep that to yourself. No one but myself and my parents know that she is anything more than what she appears. She nodded readily. I can do that. It's bad manners to pry into other people's beast companions, too much anyway. They often evolve in ways that they wouldn't have otherwise, making their original races somewhat meaningless. He glanced down at Aura, wondering if that was even possible for her race. What would a kitsune evolve into? Wasn't it already at the top of the evolutionary ladder? He shook his head, dispelling the distracting thoughts for the moment. They would find out eventually, or not, either was fine. It was up to Aura, either way. We were just about to get some breakfast. Have you eaten yet? He offered. Sure, I think the cook is already awake. Nate blinked, his foot halting in midair. Right, totally forgot about that. I won't even need to make it myself. That'll take some getting used to. Usually, it was either his mother or himself cooking breakfast. Did you and Landon learn anything interesting while you were out and about yesterday? Her face darkened. We did actually, though it certainly isn't good news. It concerns some friends of yours, in fact. Do the family names Turner and Peterson mean anything to you? Nate unconsciously kicked out his leg to make sure his knee was still working. I'm guessing you know they do, but you missed one. She shook her head once as they entered the dining room. No, the Pritchleys haven't done anything. In fact, they have been actively participating in the defense of the city. Those two families, however, fled the city yesterday. They disregarded their status and just left. It's fine for others to leave if they can, but not people in their position. They hold actual power and authority in the city, and now their absence has created a vacuum that will create ripples. In other words, things were only about to get worse. There was already some food set out on the table for people to eat as needed. Nate filled a plate for himself and a second for Aura. Can you show me on a map where both of their houses are? He asked as he sat down, an idea coming into being. She nodded slowly. What are you thinking? Just that they owe me, and I'm sure they didn't have time to take everything when they fled. I'm sure there are plenty of supplies and other goodies still left in the place. Anna coughed, turning her head to the side as pieces of egg found their way sprayed through her nose. Ew, that's disgusting. Nate scooted his plate away from her. Egg in my nose, that smells so weird, she complained. Anyway, yes, I know where they both live. That's actually a pretty good idea. Now that Nate had gotten a taste of emptying people's houses into his storage, he wanted to grab as much as he could while he had the chance. It would help his family get ahead wherever they ended up when this was all over. Otherwise, they, like so many others, would be stuck starting from nothing all over again. His parents had just started their company, and he wasn't going to let them fail now. Not if he could help them in any case. A short time later, a procession of 3 trucks left the Crichton estate. Anna was leading the group while Landon was taking up the rear. Lindsay was driving the middle truck, with Angela and Nate in it. The girls' parents had been hesitant at first to let them leave the property, but had eventually agreed under the condition they brought others. It was an easy choice to make, and now they were on the road heading to the first of the houses. Unlike the day before, the roads weren't nearly as packed with cars and crazy drivers. There were still a few out and about, but most had figured out they couldn't leave and eventually returned home. The city was still surrounded by beasts. There was no escaping them just yet. All their clogging the roadways accomplished was making it harder for those who needed to reach the wall to get there. The wall would either fall in its entirety, or the beasts would die. With the city surrounded as it was, there would be no escape for most of them. Chapter 122. The house the Petersons had lived in was massive. It easily qualified as a mansion, though it lacked the large estate that the Crichtons had for their holdings. All it boasted was the size of the house, and a rather modest backyard. The family may have had money, but they were obviously nowhere near the level of the Crichtons or Lindsay's family. Although Nate had never actually seen the Travers estate, he knew enough about them to know it wouldn't be small. Unfortunately, it was immediately obvious that the family had either been putting on airs the entire time, or all their money was somewhere else. All the items in the house were fake. Every golden candelabra, silver fork, and fine vase was plated and fake. They looked good, but they were thin veneers, nothing more. The group's stop there ultimately ended up being rather short overall, as the amount of supplies they found was limited. Nate still managed to walk away with a number of manuals for different affinities, and a couple for energy skills. They weren't anything impressive, however. More information was always appreciated. At some point, he wanted to experiment with creating or modifying energy skills. That was far in the future still, and depended on him continuing to evolve his skill, Basic Ties. Brick Jones had definitely been onto something when he had made sure Mira gave him that particular skill. It was one that had hidden depths to it, far beyond what was immediately apparent. None of that stopped Nate from grabbing everything he deemed somewhat valuable that wasn't nailed down. TVs, laptops, and books all went inside a new tab. All the food and other immediately usable supplies went into the back of the trucks to be taken back to the estate. Well, that was a disappointment, Lindsay said as their procession of trucks hit the road again toward the second house. The other two nodded. How common is it for people to decorate their houses with cheap knockoffs like that? Nate wondered aloud. It depends on a couple of factors, Angie began. The Petersons were fairly new to their wealth and station in life, at least as these things go. I think it was the current head of the house, Randall, whose father, that raised them to where they are now. They haven't had generations to accumulate their wealth and the items in their house. Unless they wanted to waste their money, they were left with two options. Not displaying how rich they are or doing what they did. What are the other factors you mentioned? The family itself, and where they want to put their money. She shrugged. Though, usually those sorts of families don't worry about the image they give off anyway. You'll notice that there is nothing like that in her house, Lindsay interjected with a smirk. However, the entire place pretty much smacks of wealth as it is. Angie shrugged. I'm not going to apologize for something my family has worked tirelessly to obtain. Nate looked out the window, tuning the two girls out as they started what he sensed was a familiar topic of playful bickering for them. The city was surprisingly intact. There were a few people who were going around attempting to loot, but that was it. Stealing and creating too much trouble was surprisingly hard in a world where nearly anyone could be a cultivator. You could never tell if the store you were about to rob was staffed by someone in the same realm as you, or maybe even higher. This wasn't like the stories he had read on Old Earth, where the higher your cultivation, the more people respected you. That was true to an extent here, but it was also mainly just another aspect of who they were. Unless they were full-time expedition hunters, the professionals, then their actual cultivation only came into play during the required expeditions. Still, after seeing how panicked everyone had been the day before and full the roads had been, Nate had been expecting more damage and fires set by angry mobs and the like. For the moment, at least, the area he could see looked relatively normal. Anna was already out of the truck she had been in, and was talking to a man that Nate recognized as Leon Pritchley when they arrived at the Turner mansion. Leon was the father of the girl who had held back during the attack on him. She hadn't possessed the mental fortitude at the time to stop people that she considered friends from doing something she knew was wrong. However, she also hadn't participated in it. Leon's eyes flickered to the girls and Nate as they exited the truck. They were both many things, I will give you that, and their boys were worse. However, never in the years that I have known them have they shown themselves to be cowards. Anna pointed at the door of the house. After you then. You came here for a reason. We don't mind entering the house after you. We just came from the Peterson place though, and it had been abandoned. Absolutely garish interior. He winced at that comment. Yes, most of those were bought years ago when they were just starting out. They never replaced them, regardless of how often we told them that they needed to. I'd like to say that they were a reminder of where they came from, but I think we both know that would be a lie. Leon ran a hand through his hair, smoothing it back as he nodded to Angie and Lindsay. Nathan, you are looking well. I was disappointed to hear about your corps. However, it seems my concerns were at least partially misplaced, as I see you have already raised its rank by 1. Impressive. With the pleasantries over with, he turned to the door, and after finding it locked, simply broke it down with a well-placed kick. The inside of the house was completely empty. They had packed everything down to the last piece of silverware when they fled. I don't know how appropriate this is to say, Nate began hesitantly, as they all came back together in the foyer after combing through the large house. But I don't think their leaving was a last-minute decision. With everything that was in this house, they would have needed multiple moving trucks or several storage bracelets of a large size. Leon was completely pale. The faith he'd possessed in his friends shattered. He didn't even react to what Nate said. He couldn't. The evidence suggesting otherwise was non-existent. The group left him standing in the entryway of the house, a lost look on the man's face as they drove away. His friends had utterly betrayed him and the city. What was perhaps worse was they hadn't even had the decency to invite him along. Back at the Crichton estate, they found all three groups of parents waiting for them, wanting an update on the city. They were still in contact with people on the wall, but more and more cultivators were deciding not to show up for their assigned shifts. Everyone knew the wall would fall, and instead, they were choosing to look after their families. After the ill-advised attempt to leave the city yesterday, people were grouping up and creating their own little shelters. No one was under any illusion that the city would be anywhere near the same after this was over and done with. The period of rebuilding would be harsh on them, and while they were nearing winter, that wasn't too much of a concern for the cultivators. Nate simply wished he could do more, but he couldn't. The sort of things that he was capable of doing in the dungeon were limited to the dungeon. That was his space. The city most definitely was not. Aiden Crichton, Angie's father, immediately headed to his office to begin making some phone calls to other cities after hearing what they had to say. Do you think the McFaddens are still around? Janet was related to one of them, wasn't she? Niall asked. If just these two families leaving is creating a power vacuum, them doing the same would cause an absolute collapse. Let's not get ahead of ourselves here, Trissa, Angie's mother said. I know you don't like them. We don't particularly care for them either way, Nina interrupted her. It was Jace we didn't like. The McFaddens were more or less typical powerful, rich people in our dealings with them, always trying to use their influence to force us to back down. Luckily for them, what we wanted was something their money could provide. The proper ingredients to upgrade Nate's core. Lisa, Lindsay's mother, coughed, directing their attention to her. In answer to Niall's question. Yes, Dean Turner is Janet's stepbrother. So, the question about whether or not they are still here isn't entirely without merit. Even if they are, she might know where he fled, since it seems he was far more prepared than Randall. Nate slowly backed away from the gathering. It sounded as though they were going to check on the McFadens after all, and that was not something he was interested in. He would rather spend his time working on his meditation art. For the moment at least, he had finished working on the first stanza with basic ties, and had moved on to the second one. There were still a few yellow words in the first stanza, but he could live with that for the moment. He needed to keep moving forward, which meant that he needed to work toward understanding the next stanza, and then beginning to modify it. He already knew what the entire art was supposed to mean as a whole. It would be impossible to modify it properly otherwise, as he would risk changing the meaning of things too much. Knowing what something meant as a whole, and the deeper meaning behind a localized stanza, however, was not the same thing. This was generally the main step for a cultivator before they integrated them into their meditation models. With him, it was simply another step on the path he was creating for himself. He had already begun to work toward understanding the second stanza days before, and was eager to get back to it. Angie and Lindsay followed him out, with Aura slipping away a moment later as well. "What are you up to?" Lindsay wondered as they followed along behind him. He chuckled at the incongruency going on at the moment. They were inside Angie's house, and yet they were following him. "I'm going to go get some studying done on my meditation art," he told them honestly. "The way I'm doing it is a little convoluted, and will take a while to complete. However, the results should be exceptional if it works out." "You're talking about the changes you've been making basic ties?" Angie asked. He nodded. "Mr. Jones told you?" "He came by the other day after this had all just started, and told us both in confidence what you had discovered. He had brought the basic ties skill book from the school just so we could both learn it right then," Lindsay said softly. "Oh, that's good then," he replied with a grin, not particularly minding that the teacher had told them. It had never even occurred to him that the man would keep it a secret anyway. "And? How's it been going? Have you made any progress with the skill, or your meditation arts yet?" The two girls frowned and shook their heads. "It's not going so good on my part," Angie said after a moment. "I haven't gotten it to work on my meditation art at all, and it's confusing when used on other things." Lindsay nodded, her face more than a little red with embarrassment. Okay, well, I guess the first thing we need to do is make sure you both understand how the skill works. Brick did say that the way I use mine was different than the way he used his, or something. Worst case scenario, you'll both have to wait until the skill has evolved to do this. However, I don't really see why that would be the case, since all three of us have really only just gotten the skill.